Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you so much for this. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our fourth session today, session four, spectrum usage, property right, privatization, and trading of the resource. In our session today, we will try to answer some important questions, such as should regulator decide what radio service and what technology utilize a specific frequency band? To what extent market-based regime to be led to determine the use of frequency bands? And should the spectrum user be given the right to use it only or the right to earn income from it and transfer it to others? However, before starting the session, I would like firstly to thank our host today, the ITU and CITC, in addition to Forum Global. Thank you so much. And I'm personally very happy with what Saudi Arabia has been achieving globally under the leadership of His Excellency, Dr. Mohammed Tamimi. And of course, that wouldn't be possible without the assistance of his outstanding team, especially Dr. Mohammed Al-Utaibi and Mr. Mohammed Al-Ganoubi. Secondly, to give you a brief introduction to our distinguished panelists today, and let's start with Professor Dr. Scott Wollaston, President and Senior Fellow of Technology Policy Institute. It's not a secret now that I'm personally a big fan of Dr. Scott's work on a spectrum in a specific and on technology and telecom policy in general. And I would recommend our audience to check his regular podcast entitled Two Think Minimum Podcast, especially the last one addressing WRC 19 with the Ambassador Grace Coe. Dr. Scott has been always one step ahead when it comes to telecom policy, and I was surprised that he partially addressed our topic today in his seminal contribution in 2013 entitled, Is There Really a Spectrum Crisis? We also have the privilege of having Mr. Brett Tarnatzer. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but I give it a try. Mr. Brett is the head of Spectrum at GSMA. If you ever heard of the concept entitled incentive auction as adopted by the FCC, that's mostly was Brett's work. Brett's effort within the GSMA has been very instrumental during the last decade, especially within the last WRC 19, where I think almost more than 14 gigahertz of spectrum were identified for IMT. It's also very beneficial for our panel and workshop today to hear the views of Dr. Martha Suarez, President of DSA. I personally think that the DSA community is very lucky to have Dr. Martha on board. She has been recently very active along the globe when it comes to Wi-Fi 6 and the future of 6 gigahertz band. And finally, I'm quite happy to be joined today with my dear colleague, Dr. Muhannad Jawad. Dr. Muhannad is a senior manager of spectrum policy at Intelsat, and he's one of the main pillars of the satellite industry, especially within the Arab world. And I think he should be very proud with the current advancement in the satellite industry during the last years. So without any further ado, and knowing that it's us between the audience and the keynote speaker, the great Professor Martin Cave, let's start our panel today with our introductory statement from our distinguished panelists. And I would like to start with Dr. Scott. Dr. Scott, please.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you for that very generous and kind introduction. And also thank you to the ITU and CITC and Global Forum for inviting me and for producing a really fascinating conference. So let's go back and remember why we've largely moved to flexible use licenses. So spectrum used to be assigned almost entirely by what we now call beauty contests, right? And different groups would come in and argue to the regulator why what they wanted to do with it was the best use. And those groups could be private sector or the government itself. And we put together, different groups would have competing reports, competing technical reports, and the regulator would try to make the best decision possible about what that spectrum should be used for. The problem was that even if the regulator would make the right decision at the time, it didn't recognize the assigning spectrum to a particular use didn't recognize that technology and demand for wireless services would change. And you then therefore need to change what the wireless, what the frequency can be used for. And today we still struggle with how to repurpose spectrum that had been assigned to a specific purpose to something new. So the answer was flexible use licenses, where you can do anything you want with a given spectrum license within certain within certain constraints, particularly with respect to interference. And the key advantage is that they allow for innovation and change without the endless lobbying and ability of interested parties to block them. Because it's somebody who has a license, it's in their interest to move the license along if they can't use it, if they can't maximize maximize profits with it anymore. But of course, they don't work on their own. You need a way for the licenses not just to move to other uses, but to other users, which means you need secondary spectrum markets as well. So secondary markets broadly means that when one private seller is selling to another private seller or any other buyer, and it's not organized by the government, although it still may take place within a market framework organized by the government. And there are, of course, different kinds of secondary markets. Some people at one extreme might even say that every time you place a phone call, you're engaged in a secondary market transaction because you're using some spectrum and space on some capacity on someone's network. And at the other extreme is actually buying a spectrum license or part of a spectrum license, or even leasing a spectrum license, spectrum use from somebody else. And this took a long time to happen. Remember, Ronald Coase had his famous paper in 1959 where he proposed something like this, and he just wasn't taken seriously. But now, at least in the US, not only do most new allocations are done via flexible licenses, but billions of megahertz pops of frequency change hands every year. And this combination of flexible use licenses and secondary markets is what has made, as I found and others as well, that licenses that allow for flexible use are more valuable than other spectrum licenses, all else equal. And again, just to conclude, I think the key reason is that the flexible use licenses plus secondary market transactions makes for a low transactions cost way for spectrum to be used in new services and change as demand and supply changes. And that's been a major advancement in spectrum policy. And I'm happy to be here to talk about it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scott. And let's hear it also from Mr. Brett of GSMA. Mr. Brett, please.
Great, thank you so much. I think that the rise of market-based approaches to spectrum management is both a result of and a driver of amazing innovation in spectrum-based technology today. I think while the idea of market taking care of spectrum management is interesting, I think there's also an important role for regulators as well. We have to remember that all roads, even the Autobahn, have rules and traffic cops. So I think, as with everything, there's a balance that has to be struck between the sufficient flexibility to allow and encourage innovation and enough structure to provide the certainty for investment and to manage interference. I can make sense of the current trend for really flexible use, even fully unlicensed spectrum in some cases, because our airwaves are getting fuller and fuller with a variety of different uses and users. And I think, in a crowded environment where you can't really add more room, you may need more flexibility and creativity. But the rules are also more important than ever. The idea of total flexibility is great, but let's not forget that the services that we rely on so much today, especially in the mobile area, are built on a base of exclusively licensed spectrum, albeit with a flexible framework underneath that. These licenses that are covering a set of frequencies over a defined geographic area have provided the certainty of access to spectrum that is needed to justify the really massive infrastructure investment that has been and will continue to be required. But the flexibility for technology to evolve in those bands from 3G to 4G to, you get the picture, is really what keeps the industry moving forward. So for the mobile industry, this exclusive licensing has really been incredibly important. But the industry has also benefited from access to other types of licenses, such as frequency coordinated point-to-point licenses for backhaul and unlicensed bands that allow mobile users to roam onto Wi-Fi. I think in all of it, balance is the key, and that requires really careful planning. The GSMA's public policy position on spectrum assignment is that sufficient exclusively licensed spectrum needs to be made available for mobile services, but spectrum licenses should be technology and service neutral to support innovation and evolution. Again, a balance. It doesn't say all spectrum must be exclusively licensed, but we note the important role that that has played as a real base. In a world with exclusive licenses as part of the assignment approach, voluntary spectrum sharing makes good sense and should be encouraged to promote efficiency and efficient use over the duration of the license. But again, balance is the key. And to guard against abuse, safeguards can be put in place. For example, the most recent spectrum trading guidelines by the Nigerian Communication Commission, their framework for sharing and trading spectrum allowed spectrum to be traded by eligible licensees that held spectrum for up to 2 years and had met at least a 25% rollout target specified in the license. Given the rapid pace of evolution, though, in the telecom sector, if there's one thing that we've all learned, it's that the system of spectrum management can't be static, as Scott just said. It requires spectrum management to managers to periodically review approaches and adjust to current needs and realities. Before joining the GSMA, as Mohammed mentioned, I was lucky enough to be part of one of those reassessment projects at the Federal Communications Commission in the USA. It was called the Broadcast Incentive Auction. It was an interesting approach to deal with an encumbered band, the UHF bands that have been mainly used for terrestrial TV, when there was growing demand for access to that spectrum by other services, in this case 4G and now 5G mobile use. At its highest level, it allowed broadcasters to offer some or all of their spectrum usage rights. Some came from the fact that in order to clear spectrum in the UHF band, broadcasters could offer to move to the less crowded VHF band or offer to share a channel with another broadcaster. And then the band could be repacked and cleared spectrum would be offered for bid. It was a two-sided market of offers to sell usage rights and offers to buy cleared spectrum, with the FCC organizing it rather than allowing for individual trades to be made. It was an interesting exchange of property rights between the two services, facilitated and managed by the regulator. I just want to give a really brief insider's perspective on a couple of the big innovations to highlight here. One, the auction mechanism itself was a clever one, but really it was a modification of a well-known and well-trusted spectrum auction approach. The FCC organized it with a descending auction to determine the lowest price for clearing a given amount of spectrum, followed by an ascending auction to determine the price for that cleared spectrum. If the revenue for the ascending exceeded the cost of clearing from the descended, plus a little bit of extra for some other public policy items, then the auction cleared and those trades would be made. But I think the most innovative and exciting part was the work that went on before the auction and during the processing of the descending auction bids, the part I call the art of the possible. And I think it has implications for spectrum management going forward. Here, the incentive auction team used operations research approaches, fancy mathematical algorithms and computing to determine in near real time what a repacked UHF band could look like and still meet the defined interference criteria that protected the property rights of the incumbents. This took into account not only interference between US broadcast TV stations, but also TV to mobile and mobile to TV, and then expanded all of that to include Canada and Mexico. This repacking algorithm work was used before the auction to do studies to figure out what could be possible. And then during the auction to make sure that broadcasters would be protected and that the spectrum could truly be cleared from round to round in the bidding. So these sorts of approaches could be incredibly useful in any number of situations, like examining the feasibility of other incentive mechanisms or just in cross-border planning and replanning. Repacking bands is expensive and time-consuming, and if you have an international border, it makes it even more complex. The repacking algorithms allow you to explore different scenarios and drive to the best approach. So for any of you who are involved in the 2006 ITU work on planning the digital terrestrial broadcasting transition in regions 1 and 3, think of this as G06 on steroids. So I'm making a call here for more research and more work on how we can make more efficient use of our spectrum while still providing a level of certainty for the services that need it and flexibility that those who will benefit from that. I think we really got our work cut out for us, but it's part about what makes this work so exciting. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Brett. I know you showed that incentive auction was easy. You explained it easily, but I know there has been a lot of work behind it. Thank you so much for this. And now with the introductory remarks of Dr. Martha, I'm not sure if it's good afternoon or good morning. Dr. Martha?
Yeah, it is still good morning, Mohammed. Thank you. So, I'm very pleased to be here today. Thank you very much to the CITC and the ITU for this invite. And just before we start, I would like to give a few remarks about DSA and our different policy positions in all these discussions. So I represent the DSA. We are the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance, a global cross-industry non-for-profit organization, and we promote flexible access to the spectrum, dynamic spectrum access and spectrum sharing. And we do so because we think that it's a great way to improve connectivity and also new opportunities and business cases. So this, that being said, I would like to start addressing this session, commenting on different perspectives. We think it all started with the CITC conversation about the future of technologies and how to foster innovation in the telecom field. So we celebrate this initiative. We celebrate the National Spectrum Strategy 2020-2025. And we have seen that there are many great ideas about how to accelerate innovation and emerging radio technologies. And in particular, we have to say that we approve a balanced vision of enabling more access to unlicensed spectrum, so more portions of the spectrum for unlicensed access, but also flexible frameworks that could move in between licensed, completely licensed systems and unlicensed. So the DSA advocates for this type of approach and policies that promote these opportunities. So it doesn't have to be black and white. There are so many opportunities for spectrum sharing in different frequency bands that we think that it's very relevant to consider them. Also, what we have seen is that now industry and there are many solutions that could be implemented. And we have more and more examples of best practices in different regions, in different countries that are considering and implementing spectrum sharing. And some of the key advantages of that is that we are having a larger ecosystem, a wider ecosystem. So it means that we are not only relying on a few stakeholders to provide connectivity, but we could have more interested parties. And that is very important for mobile communications. It's important also because we could have more investment and we could have quickly deployments and solutions. Another important aspect of spectrum sharing is that instead of having long and complicated clearance processes, we are really targeting the main goal of most of the spectrum regulators, that is to make an efficient use of the spectrum. So we are protecting incumbents, and at the same time, it's a way to create opportunities for new entrants. So instead of having to say like, okay, a frequency band should be used only for a particular service, we are having spectrum sharing between different services, but also between different stakeholders through a flexible licensing regime. So, so we think that that is really, really targeting the purpose of making efficient use of the spectrum. And we have so many examples that I hope we will have the time to discuss during this session. We just had in the previous panel, also discussions about verticals and new opportunities for enterprises, universities, schools, business cases, manufacturers, etc. In that case, spectrum sharing is also very important because it's like a third way in order to complement the opportunities of licensed spectrum and unlicensed solutions. There are many opportunities there. And if I may finalize with these introduction remarks, we think that there are different, in the case of unlicensed spectrum, there are also a lot of new technologies, a lot of innovation that is trying to be worldwide adopted, because that creates economies of scales. And that is the case of Wi-Fi 6E. So we are seeing a lot of interest in different governments, in different regulators, about having a flexible framework for unlicensed access in the 6 gigahertz band in particular, that would enable that innovation. And I said that this would be my last comment, but now it will be. There are also huge opportunities in terms of spectrum sharing, not let me just focus on that, for systems that are a little bit more flexible in terms of frequency bands. So I'm referring here to coexistence between terrestrial and non-terrestrial networks. So that could be the case of satellites and hubs and terrestrial systems. We also think that that will be very important as for new technologies, and spectrum sharing in those millimeter bands is natural because of the propagation characteristics of the waves. So we also see a lot of opportunities for spectrum sharing in those types of systems with hubs and now with the considerations of HIPs. So just to close, there are many opportunities. Spectrum sharing could be implemented with different colors and flavors. There is not only one solution. I agree with the conclusion of the previous panels that one solution doesn't fit all. And we think that spectrum sharing will be really the future. we will need more and more spectrum sharing. And it's important to consider the right conditions to incentivize economic growth and wider deployments of networks. So thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martha. I got your comment about different flavors of spectrum use. It's excellent analogy, and well done on the highlighting the CITC plan. I think Saudi Arabia has a very ambitious spectrum plan, as was highlighted today by Dr. Mohammed Al-Utaibi. That is a role model for many of the Arab countries. And now let's hear it from our satellite participant, my dear colleague, Dr. Muhannad. Dr. Muhannad, please.
Thank you, Mohammed, and greetings to all. So my name is Muhannad Jawad from Intelsat. I'm the Senior Manager for Spectrum Strategy at the company. I'll be giving a quick overview in a few minutes, being the only operator of Spectrum in the panel, I believe. And I hope that some of the intervention might be relevant to this session. We're all familiar with the phrase out of sight, out of mind, sorry. What we mean here is in satellites today, the services is everywhere, and all too often it remains invisible to the general public, which is both an indication of how successful we are at integrating into the overall telecommunication market when it comes to providing the connectivity, but also sometimes it's an obstacle to properly understand the vital importance satellite plays in the interconnected world. Satellite technologies are more and more being diverse and pervasive in our everyday lives, and licensing and regulatory measures need to adapt to such services. Yet we all rely on the same core elements, the availability of radio frequencies that can operate free from harmful interference. This is important as some areas that satellite plays provide key objectives that regulators in the region, but also globally, are striving to meet in their policy. One being better broadband options for residential consumers and businesses in the hardest to reach locations where terrestrial technologies may not serve that at the moment. So a better licensing policy to spear that growth is needed. Providing better broadband connectivity with Wi-Fi, so using the satellite license, but also with an unlicensed Wi-Fi connectivity for Terrestrial means in underserved areas, but also in unserved areas where terrestrial technologies cannot meet, such as providing connectivity to aircraft and maritime vessels. This is a major growth and an inspiration of a lot of innovations, such as eSIMs in the satellite field. Another key target where satellite plays a role, and the licensing aspect needs to facilitate that, is in the universal service obligation, where a lot of regulators, for example, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia with their 2030 vision, are striving to meet universal service obligations to connect everybody in the kingdom. However, to enable such growth, administrations can work on three critical areas, I believe. Provide a better licensing framework to enable emerging satellite technologies such as eSIMs. What we mean here, for example, a blanket licensing approach to facilitate the deployment of the services. I think a lot of the barriers for satellite connectivity has been in the bottleneck when it comes to licensing, where sometimes the licensing fees are quite expensive. Liberalizing the spectrum use to enable greater exploitation of new technologies, such as, for example, satellite with HAPS, providing backhauling to HAPS and the HAPS providing the connectivity, or the emergence of NGSO satellite constellations. And where necessary, consider actions to ensure efficient use of bands already available for satellites, or consider additional spectrum use. This is where the WRC, there are a number of agenda items on that particular matter. So today, a wide range of benefits are delivered via satellites, but the ability to use the spectrum, and this is something that's maybe some of the panel, the viewers are not familiar with, is that satellite actually uses spectrum quite efficiently, because we use the same spectrum as one operator versus another operator. And this is done through geographical geo-arc coordination or coordination agreements. And I think some of that lessons learned could be actually applied to the terrestrial side, where today the terrestrial doesn't share as much spectrum as satellite does in terms of coordination agreements. And I think we need to consider that to account and update some of the licensing framework when it comes to imposing obligations on the terrestrial connectivity. For example, my colleague in the panel has mentioned the NCC has put in 25% of obligations for the MNOs to provide connectivity to at least 25% of the population, I believe. We need to see more of that in order to bridge the digital divide. Some of the practical measurements to protect the FSS that administrations can support is taking a long-term view of predictability and equitable access to spectrum in all bands, and to also provide mitigation measures. We know today that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia Regulatory Authority has issued a consultation looking at their 5G rollout and their roadmap for deploying 5G. We provided responses to such consultations, and I think it's important to do that in order to make sure that regulatory access to our spectrum is safeguarded with the right mitigation measures to protect us from newcomers. And supporting the growing number of small and nano satellite by facilitating access to suitable spectrum for such technologies. I know that Technia Space, as a major scientific institute in the kingdom, has been doing a lot of work in that field, and it's important to ensure the spectrum that they use for telecommand and control services in C-band, for example, is safe for them to operate. Operators such as Arabsat use C-band quite extensively as well. And there are a number of agenda items at the WRC that are looking at C-band uplink, but also the C-band downlink. And when we talk about the C-band downlink, I think a better licensing regime for spectrum in the downlink services should be required. Here, for example, a lot of the satellite earth stations are not normally licensed in the receive direction. So a lot of regulators tend to not be aware of them and the extensive use of them. So we need to ensure the protection of these terminals. And one way of doing that is by having regulators look at updating their licensing products offered today and improve the process for licensing earth stations, for example. And this is discussed, for example, in agenda item 1.3. When it comes to the management of satellite filings, we're quite different than terrestrial side, where we don't actually apply for spectrum through an auction. This is done through a filing process at the ITU, where the process of obtaining internationally recognized orbital and frequency assignment is done. I believe one particular key area where administrations can improve on is ways to improve this process to make it as efficient as possible for the stakeholders. And my final thoughts to conclude is I believe that there has been a positive evolution of new technologies and related services in the satellite field, such as the role of satellite in 5G, for example. But this will only be possible if an easy-to-access regulatory and licensing framework is put in place. Regulators need to take that into account, and this is our request to the administrations, where a general authorization regime combined with an automatic and certified registration process would be important to ensure the smooth operation of satellite services. And last but not least, it's vital to ensure that adequate spectrum is available, particularly in C-band, where a lot of the usage is done in this region, in the MENA region. And this must be remained accessible to provide the regulatory sustainable certainty for current and planned investment in C-band for the region and globally. So with that, I conclude my opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mohammed. I can see with only the introductory remark, we have started to have some interesting questions from the audience. But before going to these questions, I would like to ask each one of you just one or two questions. And my first question is to Dr. Scott. And frankly, I'm tempted to ask you the same question that you have asked in your paper, and ask you, is there really a spectrum crisis? But instead, let's focus on one quote in that particular paper that I find very interesting, which is that flexible use licenses are significantly more valuable than licenses that dictate a specific allowed use, and that policy uncertainty depresses license value. Can you kindly emphasize on that and reflect on the current debate on privatization? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mohammed. Partly it's an empirical result, and the finding is that the flexible use licenses, all else equal, are more valuable than other licenses. And of course, the all else equal part is important because, as somebody's already pointed out in the comments, different spectrum frequencies sell for different amounts. They're good for different things, and this also have different values. That also affects it. And the policy uncertainty part is related to a point that that Brett made, that you want to make sure that you can invest and expect some kind of return. And in that case, it's not referring specifically to certainty about the licenses, but sort of the broader macroeconomic conditions. And so the more likely, the more certain you are that you'll be able to earn a return on your investment without having it expropriated, for example, that affects it as well. And the certainty part for the licenses, I think goes to whether you think the rules are going to be changed on you or not. I wanted to follow up on a couple of things. One is that we've also been talking now about unlicensed spectrum and dynamic use spectrum, and I think the next big innovation thing, the next big thing that we have to work on is how we make decisions on whether spectrum will be licensed, unlicensed, shared, or some other model. We used to make all licensing decisions based on the regulator, based on command and control, and we've backed that up now. So now we auction licensed spectrum so that we sort of have market mechanisms. And then the FCC did this great two-sided market, the broadcast incentive auction, to find a market-based way to kind of free spectrum that had been stuck in a previous use. But we're still at a stage where the regulator decides whether spectrum should be licensed, unlicensed, or shared, or possibly other models. And so we end up, we still do essentially a beauty contest for that phase. And so we don't really know whether the market wants, whether the market demands more unlicensed or more shared, or less unlicensed or less shared. We just don't know. And I think that's something that we need some urgent work on, especially as more and more models emerge. We want to make sure that spectrum is going to the right places, and I don't think we have a good sense of that yet.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scott. I certainly agree with you that we don't know the future. We don't know whether more spectrum should be allocated to licensed versus unlicensed. But let's see what our colleague has to say about that. So, Brett, I have this specific question in the light of the standardization process and this maybe unilateral word of 3GPP. Are you thinking that a tight standardization process could actually curtail a market-based approach?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think that the convergence of standards and the really wide compatibility of devices, has really been successful for the mobile industry. I mean, you just have to look at LTE and 5G that have such a wider ecosystem of devices and technology than we saw in the 2G and 3G era. So, we know that this kind of standardization will lead to economies of scale and to lower cost devices. So I think where the market can get to a single standard, that's great. But I also don't think those standards should be forced on anyone. I think it's important to let the market choose the right technology in the long run. I mean, even in the 5G era now, you look at India, and there are some players in the market that are looking at a country-specific 5G standard. I don't know if that'll work for them. Perhaps in a limited situation, perhaps that too will evolve. But the market's going to work it out. So I think, the idea of that standardization, or at least that framework and protocol there, is important. But I think we also have to let the market work. Again, I keep going back to it, but it's a balance, and I think that's really important.
Thank you so much, Brett. Let's try to find that balance by the end of this panel. But now, Dr. Martha, and now we're talking about trading and secondary market. Do you think, is it possible that trading and secondary market could be deployed to DSA principles and technologies and applications?
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed, for this question. I wanted to add a few remarks about secondary markets. So in theory, these type of transactions are very efficient because they will recognize the market needs, and then they will act accordingly. But what we have seen in practice in many cases is that there are not enough incentives for those that hold the spectrum, and especially if they have it on a national basis, to have transaction with other new entrants that want to access that spectrum. We had seen in the case of the US, there was a survey in 2017 where WISPA, the Wireless ISPs Association, made this survey, and they noticed that about 30% of their members tried to engage in secondary market transactions, but at the end, only 10% of them were successful because there were not enough incentives, and because it's hard for a big player to trade spectrum with smaller players. And that we could expect similar behaviors with verticals and other types of access. So in that sense, from the DSA perspective, we have two ideas that could enhance this type of transactions. So the first one is to implement use it or share it policies. So it means that when the regulator is assigning the spectrum to a particular entity, they will have the right to use it on exclusive basis. But in those places where they are not using it, then there could be opportunities for spectrum sharing. So that is the first concept. And the second one would be also to rely on automated solutions, because sometimes also the problem is that, okay, there is an agreement between the parties. They want to have a secondary market transaction, but then they have to go to the regulator. And the regulator needs to approve any transaction. But that process, sometimes they have just tented another solution. So we also think that databases and automated tools that will allow this type of transactions are more transparent, could be very fast if the regulator puts the rules in place. So those are just a few considerations about these type of solutions, and we think that it should really take into account the market. That is important, and also to allow new stakeholders, even if they are non-for-profit and they want to provide coverage, to access the spectrum.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martha. It's amazing how we all can respond to the same question with different answers, giving our different backgrounds. But now it's time for the satellite industry to defend themselves against the claim that usually they don't like sharing. And my question is to Dr. Muhannad. How does the satellite industry usually share spectrum to provide satellite services?
Thanks, Mohammed, for putting me on the spot. I'm not sure if that's a known claim by the industry that we don't like sharing. I think it's a matter of sometimes it's physics, but sometimes also regulatory certainty. In terms of the physics, the ability of satellite earth stations to receive the signal from such a far away geostationary arc, or even a non-geostationary satellite, by the time the signal arrives on Earth, it's very, very weak and very sensitive. So it can be easily interfered with when you're introducing a terrestrial service that is using the same frequency. And that's why the element of sharing is sometimes challenging, if not possible. And this is proven by various studies that have been conducted in the ITU, but also in different regulatory authorities. Where we do have a good ability to share is when it comes to coordination agreement between satellite operators, as I mentioned. But there are also sometimes possibilities to coexist with other technologies, such as terrestrial mobile, for example, based on certain conditions. And this is what I try to highlight. When regulatory authorities like the CITC issue consultations, we try and respond to them in the best ability that we can to ensure that there are mitigation measures in place to allow that coexistence. But I just wanted to add a point about the risk of spectrum and oversupply of spectrum. I think it's very important for regulators to be aware of. Currently today, audits need to be taken in place before auctions take place. Audits to ensure that the auction is providing necessary spectrum to meet that technology. Because in many cases, when you do the audit, you discover that there is a lot of spectrum that's still available today that is not being utilized or licensed. And this is an important point that regulators need to look at very carefully. And I also believe that there is inefficient use of spectrum if you supply the market. This leads to non-competitive auctions, and in many cases, lowers the auction revenues when you oversupply the market of a spectrum that has already been available today. And there are a lot of technologies, for example, we hear from the terrestrial entities that we need more spectrum, but it has to be met by the fact that the available spectrum is not being used. And then the second issue is that this risks that the valuable spectrum goes unsold or underutilized for extended periods of time. So we want to avoid such scenarios happening. And I think the best way to do that is regulators need to conduct audits before auctions take place.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muhannad. As we are going into the end of our panel, I'm very tempted to state some tricky questions from the floor and a couple of comments for our keynote speaker, Professor Martin Weiss and Professor William Leher. So one question that is from Mr. Osama Obaid is about the preference to use broker mechanism with independent supervision or to use secondary market mechanism with direct trading. We have also this question from Mr. Simon Pike about the obstacle of spectrum trading in case of trading the spectrum from MNO to vertical players, and whether that would affect the competition. One very important remark from Professor Martin Weiss about the fungibility in a spectrum use. And also we have this tricky, again, question from Professor William Leher of MIT about how to decide whether the licensed or unlicensed. And he point to the CVRS framework. So I think we have a lot of points that we can all comment on spectrum trading, and I would like to start with Dr. Scott. Dr. Scott?
Yeah, thanks. So I just wanted to expand a little on Martha's point about secondary markets, and that there are lots of different kinds of secondary markets. The dynamic spectrum sharing is in fact one kind of secondary market, or can be, where people get access to spectrum at different times or different places and so on. But people normally think of secondary markets as actual trading of spectrum licenses, but it doesn't have to be. As Martha said, dynamic spectrum sharing is one part of it, but also it's when one company buys access to another company's network, for example. They want to offer their own services under their own brand. They might be machine-to-machine services and so on. That's also secondary markets. And like I said, at one extreme, some people might say every time you place a phone call, you're engaged in a secondary market transaction. I think that's maybe stretching a little, but but the point is still there. And actually, then just quickly an aside, this is almost apropos of nothing, but I still wanted to say it. With the FCC's broadcast incentive auction, Brett mentioned the algorithms that they used for the repacking mechanisms. I just want to emphasize that again and point out that when he says that there are these fancy algorithms, those were machine learning algorithms. And the FCC's Spectrum team was really one of the earliest groups to use machine learning in sort of a government setting. I don't think a lot of people know that. It's a really interesting use and very clever use of machine learning in a context we just never hear about. And so even though I don't think regulators should be making strong decisions about how spectrum should be used, that doesn't mean they can't do amazing things. And that was certainly one of them. And so to going back to what Bill Lehrer's point about how we might decide between licensed and unlicensed use and so on. Bill makes this point about that CVRS, it establishes a reversible framework, and the reversible is the key part here. And I guess the question is whether it will truly be reversible if a constituency develops for a particular use and we don't have a good mechanism for actually reversing it. What are going to be the incentives to allow that reversal to happen in the future?
Thank you so much, Dr. Scott. Replying to Professor William Leher, that was interesting. And Brett, just back to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of both follow up on Mr. Lehrer's comment and on something Martha said, which I think is really interesting. So I think some of these new approaches, like CVRS, are an opportunity for us to be able to kind of gauge the appetite for completely, unlicensed and using a database to manage part of the spectrum, and then some shorter term licenses, but still exclusive and guaranteed rights, at the same time as protecting incumbents in the band. A lot is going on in that CVRS band. And so I think what we have to do really is watch it really carefully. It, like the incentive auction, is a really interesting mechanism, and it evolved over a long period of time. There is a lot of technical work that went into the kind of the back end of it and continues to go on with it. And I think we have to, I don't think the praises of the people who are working on that are sung enough. We have to keep watching that and see how things develop, because I think it's too easy to say, oh, I'm going to adopt a three-tiered approach like CVRS. You have to look at what's in the background and the rules about what can operate where and when and how that's all managed. It's a tricky but elegant system. So I think it's going to be exciting in the years to come for us to watch and see how that goes. And at some point, who knows? Maybe access to that. The general access unlicensed part is going to balloon. And so we've got to keep our eyes on that. And that's where we need to be agile in spectrum management and be ready to respond when the time comes. Thanks.
Right. Before moving to Dr. Martha, we're still receiving question. One question is from Mr. Lance Johnson about the leasing of spectrum in the 900 mega to vertical industries. Dr. Martha, please.
I was not planning to address the 900 megahertz issue, but about Mr. Laird's comment. So yeah. I was going to say, we cannot only rely on this discussion about reversing decisions, because that is a mindset of traditional systems, like exclusive license systems. I think that at some point the regulators need to ask themselves the question about, okay, what are the needs? What are the technology trends? And how can I improve connectivity? So that is the case, for example, of unlicensed access in many frequency bands. We would love to have a frequency band that would be exclusive for unlicensed access. I mean, that would solve all the questions. So no one would worry, and everyone would say, like, okay, all the unlicensed access is in that frequency band. And I wouldn't see why in the future someone would like to reverse that decision when there are billions of users of those types of systems. But let's say that that's not the ideal case. We unfortunately don't have a band that we could dedicate for exclusive unlicensed access. And that's why we need to consider systems that could have protect incumbents that are already operating in the frequency bands and define the right conditions for unlicensed access. And that is exactly what we are doing in the case of the 6 gigahertz band. It's like finding the right conditions to enable new use cases, to enable innovation without moving those that are sorry for the word, moving, like without needing needs for cleaning for spectrum clearance. Because that is the situation right now. Spectrum is a limited resource, so we cannot move everyone like in a particular frequency band. And so I think the decision about license and license, it's case by case, but in some cases we have the technologies, we could have the appropriate rules to enable new systems while protecting those that are already using the band. And I think that is the challenge for regulators, to find those situations and implement the right frameworks for that type of innovation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martha. I think we have only 1 minute to each participant for perhaps a concluding remarks on your perception on flexibility and on the ultimate question, how to reach balance between the different application and different services. And as we have ended usually with Dr. Muhannad, I would like to seek your indulgence to start with him, Dr. Muhannad, and if you can clarify your views. Dr. Muhannad?
Thank you very much. And just want to say I enjoyed being in this panel very much. In terms of some remarks to conclude, I would say there's a lot of innovations in the satellite industry, where traditionally in the past used to be in a bent pipe where a frequency goes up and same frequency comes down. Nowadays, you provide the bandwidth required for your consumers or the demand where the market is on a flexible way. A lot of the payloads on our EPIC satellites, for example, allow you to flexibly meet the demand in a particular region where that demand is increasing. And we need the regulatory environment and the licensing environment to reflect such a innovative approach. We need better licensing or facilitate a smoother licensing rollout for new applications such as eSIMs, Earth stations in motion, for example. So a lot of these things I would ask regulators to consider. Looking at blanket licensing approach and would help a lot into facilitating this service. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Muhannad. Dr. Scott?
Yeah, I think this conversation helps show why flexible use licenses are so important. We don't know what's going to be, what technologies will come about in the future and what their needs will be and what demand for them will be. There needs to be a way for Spectrum to move to those cases without having to go through something as involved as the broadcast incentive auction again. I mean, it was an amazing accomplishment, no question about it. And it would be wonderful if we didn't have to do it again. We will, but it's important to be moving to a system where we don't have to.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scott. Mr. Brett?
Yeah, I don't wish planning one of those on anyone here. I think the key is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, and there are lots of interesting ideas out there. But on these matters, the devil is always in the details. And so I think when it comes to interference protection, it comes down to the details of who needs what kind of protection and how it's provided. So I think there's a lot we've got to work with and work on, and we need to get a great toolbox of approaches and then apply them in the right way in the right situation.
Thank you so much, Brett. Dr. Martha?
Thank you. I think that my final remark would be about keeping in mind that spectrum sharing would be important for all the industries. So those that are incumbents in a particular moment may become the new entrants in the future. So, and we have so many different examples, like, for example, the case of the CVRS in the US, where that was a possibility for mobile industry to access the spectrum in mid-band. And also we have the cases for different industries. So I would just like to say that we should understand spectrum sharing as a technology approach that really is targeting the purpose of making an efficient use of the spectrum, bringing the spectrum to use for commercial and for social purposes, and that at some point anyone might benefit from that. So I think that is definitely the future, and we will see more and more of those solutions coming and being implemented.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martha. I'm very grateful to all of you. I have enjoyed this panel, although I think 1 hour is not enough at all. But our excuse is that we don't want Professor Martin Cave to wait. We've been all waiting for his keynote speech. Thank you all so much. And it's back to you, Dan. Thank you so much all.
Mohammed, thank you so much. And yeah, I'd like to again add my thanks to all of our panelists. Once again, a really interesting discussion. And I keep saying this, but it's true every time that we could have continued this one as well for a lot longer. So I'm very sorry we had to draw it to a close. But as Mohammed said, we now need to move on, because we have one last presentation today, and we are all very fortunate and very excited to welcome our last keynote speaker. So I'd now like to welcome to the stage Martin Cave. So Martin, welcome. So Martin is chairman at the UK Gas and Electricity Market Authority, but of course he's also extremely well known to everyone in the spectrum world for the huge amount of work that he's done on some of the topics that we've just been talking about in the last panel, on trading, on the opening up of spectrum markets, and I guess more broadly on helping to develop what's considered today as a big part of the modern framework that we all use for allocating and for managing spectrum. And without wanting to embarrass Martin too much, I actually read an article the other day that referred to him as the godfather of spectrum. So I think I really need to say no more than that. So Martin, it's an honor to have you with us here today, and really looking forward to your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. I'm a bit worried about that last thing. It sounds slightly blasphemous, describing me as the godfather of spectrum. But anyway, it's a great pleasure to address such a knowledgeable and informative day. I mean, as has already been said, you may deduce from my current affiliation that much of my time is now occupied with energy regulation, which is difficult enough. But in my parallel academic existence as a professor at the London School of Economics, I take a keen interest in spectrum issues, and have done so ever since 2000, when I was asked by the UK government to write a review of radio spectrum management. I'm going to take this opportunity to give a short and simple, but quite opinionated talk about spectrum auctions, past, present, and future. I'm doing so not because I think that spectrum auctions are an endangered species, because I think their effectiveness risks being curtailed in some jurisdictions by industry opposition. I begin by noting it's fairly typical for a natural resource which is in plentiful supply to be allocated administratively by government, probably at a zero price. But when or where it's scarce, that allocation becomes inefficient and market methods are called upon. Thus, we find that water in Southern California or Australia, where it's scarce, is auctioned or traded, while water rights in the United Kingdom, where for now there's often too much water and you have to pay somebody to get rid of it, are administratively assigned. In the case of mobile communications, we've witnessed the switch from spectrum plenty to spectrum scarcity. taking place with increasing speed since 1980, accompanied by a predictable and progressive switch to auctions starting in the 1990s. They are now pretty universal, but I should also add that we may want to discuss when I finish talking in a few minutes how some countries seem to manage quite well without them. I begin with two potential advantages of a competitive spectrum auction. First, in principle, it assigns spectrum to the most efficient users, which can outbid their rivals. We'll see in a moment this may not always work with inexperienced bidders. Second, an auction process captures the scarcity value of the public resource for the population, rather than leaving it in the hands lucky enough to be gifted the scarce spectrum. I should add that this attribute of auctions rests upon the proposition that the market for mobile comms, which we're chiefly talking about, will be priced up to the market clearing level by the operators in it. That seems quite likely to me. This second aspect is important. I believe that cumulative spectrum auction revenues from the 1980s at 2020 prices are pushing into $1 trillion. And that's a lot of money, which can be spent on health, education, the relief of poverty, defense, and so on. Sadly, it may not always be well used, but in many cases it will be. But apart from those two things that I've described, efficiency and the collection of rents, spectrum rents, there are two more things which spectrum auctions can do, which are very important. The auction rules can include caps on what the largest operators can buy in any auction, intended to restrain them from buying up all the available spectrum and thus eliminating or weakening their smaller rivals. And then finally, an auction can also achieve wider economic and social objectives by requiring their inclusion in the spectrum license conditions. For example, the regulator can plough some of the spectrum proceeds back, which would otherwise be received, back into the mobile sector by requiring one or more operators to extend coverage to non-commercial areas. That has worked pretty successfully in many jurisdictions, although enforcement can sometimes be difficult. Or they could require spending on handset subsidies or digital education, whatever can successfully be enforced as a licensed term. Moreover, the supply of these services can be assigned as part of the competitive auction. This frees from the regulator from having to negotiate such contract terms with a single supplier, which knows much more about costs than it does. I know from energy network regulation what a grave disadvantage this informational asymmetry puts the regulator in. All this sounds well and good, but what could possibly go wrong? Well, we all know a bunch of things can go wrong with auctions. You can have a faulty auction design. We've already heard about one Nobel Prize winner in economics, Martin Weiss's talk, but you may have noticed that in October, two US-based auction designers, Robert Wilson and Paul Milgrom, won the Nobel Prize in economics for their brilliant and inventive contributions. Unfortunately, not all designers have been so smart. There have been some conspicuous failures. A few years ago, I wrote a paper with a colleague which investigates the relationship between the choice of auction design and the realized prices using a data set covering no less than 13,000 spectrum lots, most of them, of course, in the United States. It showed that the more sophisticated design, like the simultaneous multi-round auctions and combinatorial clock auctions, which freed bidders from stranding risk, generate higher revenues. The difference is not always huge, but it is statistically highly significant. So faulty auction design is one risk. The second risk is collusion by bidders. Examples of this conduct have been discovered in the past. Then there is the winner's curse. An ill-informed bidder may overbid and fail to use the spectrum fruitfully. Over time, such bidders are likely to exit and be replaced with smarter ones. And the most troubling and intractable problem of all, in my opinion, governments may restrict spectrum availability to bid up prices. By doing so, they shoot the population in the foot by putting up connectivity prices and restricting economic growth. I despair of finding a universal solution for this problem. Now let's look at the situation recently, particularly the 5G spectrum auctions. First, many more bands have been made available, and this extension seems to have been successful. Interestingly, we've seen the start of the auctioning of shared and subordinated bands, notably the priority access licenses in the recent US CVRS auction. The prices generated look commensurate with earlier auctions. And then finally, relative prices look explicable in terms of special factors. Within the European Union, for example, they were high in Germany, where a new entrant was bidding, and in Italy, where lot packaging was unusual, and they were low in Austria, where additional competition for increased coverage was added on at the end of the process. And the regulator, if I might put it in this way, gave away a third of the auction proceeds in order to extend that coverage, because the regulator thought it was a good idea, and I suspect also because the offers were competitive. However, 5G auctions have often been subject to delays. These greatly vexed the European Commission, for example, which published a long paper about dealing with the problem in September of this year. Why is that? I think there are a number of reasons. One is that auction processes are quite often litigated, which causes delays. Second, and I speak as somebody who works in a regulatory agency and have some personal experience of this, regulators are sometimes fairly bureaucratic and slow, and we do require agility in a field as rapidly developing as mobile communications. And then thirdly, reverting to an earlier point, governments may allow excess demand for capacity to accumulate in order to enhance auction revenues. Now, what can we say about the future? First of all, it's striking to me how stable the structure of mobile communications market has been since the start, despite massive changes in products and processes. We see in many countries, and typically, 3 or 4 vertically integrated operators now increasingly sharing passive inputs, but often it's the same ones that have existed through all the vicissitudes of the mobile communications operation since 1980. The biggest rows about structural change in the sector seem to have been about whether to have 3 or 4 operators, whether to allow a merger or whether to encourage a 4th entrant. In the greater scheme of things, I'm inclined to see these disputes as an example of what Sigmund Freud called the narcissism of small differences. The greatest disputes are between people who fundamentally agree with one another on most of the issues. From the standpoint of competitive spectrum auctions alone, because all sorts of huge changes are taking place affecting these structures, I want to note one looming threat and one opportunity that I can see in the future. The threat to auctions is that 5G densification may reduce the number of local networks, and that may make competitive auctions less feasible. There just won't be enough players to bid. The second one is rather more complex. It arises from the opportunity that ubiquitous digitalization of all sectors may encourage firms in individual verticals to take charge of their own communications. These verticals, as we know, might include many different things. It could be connected cars, it could be health, it could be energy, it could be farming, it could be advanced manufacturing. They can do this, it seems to me, either by renting a wholesale network slice from a mobile operator, or they can choose to self-supply by acquiring and using their own spectrum. This last option could make spectrum auctions more competitive rather than less competitive, although it would require some quite complex orchestration for reasons which we've already heard in various sessions during the day. So to conclude, there is a 100-year-old English children's poem, a cautionary tale, which ends in the line, "Always keep a hold of nurse for fear of finding something worse." In a way, that's my message. In a competitive spectrum auction, we've got something that works well, is flexible and multi-purpose. We may want to adapt it to new circumstances and new purposes, but we lose hold of it or weaken it at our peril. And we should do this particularly because it has done us so proud in the past. So thank you for listening.
Martin, thank you so much for that. And yeah, as I said, really appreciate you you joining us and being with us to close today's proceedings. We have about almost 10 minutes left, I think, for questions. So I can see we do have quite a few questions coming in already, Martin. So if that's okay, to maybe just go with a few questions. And as a reminder to everyone out there, if you do have questions for Martin, then please do add them onto the chat as well. But yeah, so a few questions coming in already, Martin, as I mentioned. So first of all, we have a question here from Lance Johnson from Anterix, who asks, what do you think about a auction that requires payments on a yearly or bi-yearly basis, and that requires users to actually show and demonstrate that the spectrum is being used? And he says that would prevent spectrum warehousing and increase usage. So any thoughts on that as a possible model for auctions?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because an awful lot of analysis of spectrum auctions in the past has been based upon the fact that essentially you paid for the whole period of license period up at the start. And that meant, as far as you were concerned, it's a sunk cost. You'd already spent that money. When you were deciding how to price your mobile communications, economic theory and indeed commercial practice suggest you should kind of ignore it. Treat it as a sunk cost and get as much money as you can going forward. And if that's the case, the implication of that is that how much people have paid in the auction, once they have paid it all, is no longer relevant to their pricing decisions. And so that kind of finesses the question of whether high auction prices actually lead to high service prices. Now, increasingly, partly because mobile operators are getting a little bit more skint, there's been quite a big move towards annual payments, and sometimes even deferred payments. So you get 3 years free, and then you have to make up those payments later. And that means that the nature of the competitive process within the mobile system might change, and it might change adversely, because each firm might know, if I spend an awful lot on acquiring the spectrum, I'll force everybody else to do so. And then we'll all have this as common costs, and then the equilibrium price of the mobile service we're providing may also go up, which might actually be somewhat detrimental. So I can see advantages and disadvantages of that. Now, as for the use it or lose it issue, I mean, that's something that's been kicking around for ages. Not so much in mobile, because the demand for which has been growing very fast, but in other sectors as well, other sectors of spectrum use as well. And the problem is it's often really quite difficult to enforce it. I mean, you can do, but an operator could say, well, I'm not using it now, I'm going to use it next week or next year or next decade. And so you have to make sure the rules are laid down. But I do agree with the notion that if spectrum is not in use, if it's lying fallow in the regulator's cupboard because the regulator is delayed actually issuing it, then that's just an appalling net loss for everybody, for everybody in society, and for the economic advances which increased connectivity will bring. So that's a very interesting question. Thanks.
No, thank you, Martin. No, thank you very much for that. Moving on to the next question, we have a question here from William Lear from MIT, who asks, what do you think about shorter license duration terms and or smaller territory, so more localized license, I suppose. So he says more license needed for wider area coverage or more valuable for isolated entrants. So any thoughts on that?
Well, thanks, Bill. The location is quite interesting because, I mean, famously, the US started with localized licenses and thousands of them. That's why we ended up with so many observations from the sale of US spectrum lots in the study, which I referred to a few moments ago. But then it became apparent that the direction of movement of the industry, which was partly based upon consumer preferences, was towards much wider service areas. And those wider service areas, I understand, I may be wrong, could best be served by having wider spectrum licenses. I mean, that hasn't happened, I believe, in the United States. I mean, I saw in the recent US auction, the one which I referred to, the CVRS one, I think there were 23,000 separate regions, which is an absolutely staggering number. But I think in a sense, I would expect the efficient geographical coverage of a spectrum license really to depend upon consumer preferences. And I think that might be quite a good way of looking at it. But we have to accept that they may be changing those consumer preferences with new services coming in. Now, as for the question of duration, I mean, the standard answer is you need to offer a license of sufficient duration to encourage the investor to make investment in long-term physical assets, or indeed in marketing assets or things of that kind. Now, what has changed hugely is that operators now have vast portfolios of spectrum in different bands, and the substitution possibilities between bands has been realized to some extent. And I think the general effect of that would be to make them much less twitchy about shorter term licenses. But of course, if you permit licenses to be traded, and if you permit that trade not to be confined to particular uses, then that might be another way of ensuring that if operator A has a spectrum license but operator B can use it more efficiently, then that could be accomplished.
Thank you so much. And moving on, we have a couple more questions left, so just a couple of minutes left. So the next question, moving on to unlicensed spectrum. So Alexandra Contreras from Cullen asks, what do you consider is the role of unlicensed spectrum? And in particular, how should we determine whether or not there should be more or less unlicensed spectrum?
That's a huge question, and I certainly don't. I have the answer to it. Although I think it's been discussed by other people who are much more expert than I am. I mean, one of the interesting things to me is that some regulators are basically sort of requiring mobile companies which have licenses basically to sort of pass them on or make them available to others. I mean, this has been done, I understand, by Ofcom in the United Kingdom, and it has the potential to make spectrum available, which can be used, for example, for a business park in a remote area. And so you have an incredibly high level of capability there. But I think the question is an extremely difficult one. I mean, obviously, one of the great disadvantages with unlicensed spectrum is that it does tend to be irreversible. I mean, paradoxically, that's true. Trying to boot people out of unlicensed spectrum is an extremely complicated process, both technologically, because you don't know who they are, and also because it's not entirely clear what rights they have acquired by actually squatting within it. So I think it's a terrific question. I only wish I could answer it better.
I only wish we had another couple of hours, and then maybe we could go into a bit more detail on that. But listen, Martin, I think unfortunately time is running out, and I think we are going to have to unfortunately leave it there. But look, thank you so much. As I said, we really do appreciate you taking the time to join us today, and I'm sure it's fantastic to hear you give those thoughts, and I'm sure everyone has really appreciated your time and for helping us to close this day of the conference. So Martin, thank you so much, and really appreciate that.
Thank you, Dan, and everybody.
So that's a great way to wrap up the first day. So thank you to Martin, thank you to all of our speakers and to all of our panelists today. We've had a really, really interesting day. Back here again now tomorrow morning. So we have another full day tomorrow. So back here at the same time tomorrow. I think we've got another 4 or 5 sessions tomorrow, plus another couple of keynote speakers and also a thinking point. So all of the details of tomorrow's sessions are available on the conference website. I think in total we've had over 1,000 people have joined the discussions at some point today, which is absolutely fantastic. So thank you all out there for being part of the event. Thank you for all your comments, all of your questions. It's been great to hear from you. A quick reminder, actually, on the 3rd day of the conference, we're going to have an opportunity for all of you to actually come up live onto the stage and to give your thoughts and maybe some of your takeaways from the event in person. So please be ready for that. But in the meantime, tomorrow, we'd like to invite you all to come and join us again tomorrow, and please, again, to be as active on the chat function. Finally, a final reminder that all of the presentations that have been made today, all of the slides and all the recordings from the panels have been made available. They're going to be available on YouTube. And you'll also be sent out links showing you how to access all that. So anything that you've missed out on or want to catch up on, that will be available, and the team will be in touch to let you know how you can access all that information. So on behalf of myself, on behalf of CITC and ITU, thank you all so much for your participation today. Have a wonderful evening, and looking forward to seeing you back here again, same time tomorrow for day 2 of the conference. Thank you, everyone. Bye.